Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This week we're diving down into the depths of Davy Jones' locker. Captain Nagathrod is hard to spell, but not hard to play. 5 mana, 3/6 is a respectable body, the menace ability is great evasion, and every horror becomes a mill monster. To top it all off, at the end of the turn we can steal any creature or artifact that we made our opponents mill this turn, whether that was from the captain's ability or not. Nagathrod's EDHREC page is bursting with tons of excellent cards from his pre-constructed deck. Mind Flayers, which is the best deck name ever, by the way. I, for one, am totally here for the Yossification of Illithids. However, there's a tricky nature to this Nagathrod deck that isn't immediately obvious on the surface. So, let's get right into the upgrades. We'll take his average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Archidect deck building website. As always, any swaps made to the deck must either keep the total price cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the list. This deck's favorite movie genre is, of course, horror. While Umbris came along and gave us a lesson in nightmares and horrors that were used for the purposes of exiling enemy libraries, Nagatrod's a lot more interested in the thievery aspect. I definitely appreciate how different those commanders function, despite them ostensibly caring about the same creature types. Those two horror tribal decks do not have a very similar vibe or very similar play patterns, which is quite cool diversity to get to see. Also, just for the record, I can't believe they printed Hullbreaker Horror in a precon deck. That is a big wowza moment from me. Now, before we begin with the upgrades, let's briefly examine some core cards. The horrors are, of course, the main attraction. This average list even contains a Toxrill, which is a truly bonkers card. My personal picks for MVPs, though, are things like Consuming Aberration or Night Howler or Guilt Feeder. Not only will Consuming Aberration mill, but with the Captain's Evasion, it's a potent and a lethal threat, as are the others. Payoffs for tons of mill are just amazing for this deck, and delightful to see. But with that said, here's the tricky thing about the deck. I've kind of found that the mill effects tend to be potentially more important than any individual horror. While the horrors might mill a handful of cards, these spells will mill a chunk of cards, and that often gives our commander more options to choose from. The difficult thing about the deck is simply making sure that we're wise about our targets. A Spellslinger deck, for example, may not give us many relevant things to steal, so we have to find an opponent whose deck looks like it might have the best rewards for our purposes. And we have to be careful too, because if a player dies and leaves the game, they'll take all those stolen toys away with them. We have to stay on our toes, but that gives us a lot of fun things to do while we're playing it. So let's just make a few swaps to help this ship sail a little smoother. Normally I divide these videos into 3 sections, but for this commander, I don't have that many swaps to make. So there's only going to be one section, and there's only one thing to call it. Oh, the horror. This pirate doesn't wait for anyone, we're jumping right in. I think I said it already, but I don't have a whole lot of swaps to make to this video, and the swaps that I do make will stay pretty tight within that average budget. The thing that I think will most help us improve when we're piloting and tinkering with this deck is to pay attention to the ways that we want to balance a niche strategy, horror tribal, with a more well-established strategy, mill. It's a little bit tricky to do, but I believe in us. Let's get to it. The first card that caught my eye was this here in Garruk's Wake. 9 mana for a board wipe is not it. This is so expensive. Most of the time when we need to cast a board wipe, it's because we're lagging behind and we need to equalize the board state when we have almost nothing in play. So I'm exchanging this for my favorite budget board wipe, Deadly Tempest. Token decks are a nightmare for our menace horrors, so I like the wipes that help punish those players and that don't cost 9 mana to cast. After that, I think I'll have to be a bit of a jerk and cut the card from the Catacombs. I really like the initiative mechanic, but I think a deck would need to focus more on that mechanic to sustain it, and I'm not convinced that this deck is capable of that. As one-off reanimation effects go, this one's not the most stellar thing we've ever seen either, so I don't think we'll miss it too badly. Actually, while we're at it, let's examine more of these creatures. This deck even contains great non-horror creatures to further assist with the strategy, which I'd usually be a stickler about, because I enjoy a tribal deck that fully commits. However, I will actually be cutting some of the horrors here. Forgotten Creation and Phyrexian Revoker. I want to like these, but they just really didn't perform for me. Most of our other horrors have effects like stealing abilities, or milling, or getting enormous, or even killing creatures, or countering spells. But these effects are minimal and just feel out of place. And the important part is that a horror isn't always as good to us as a mill spell. Nagathrod might get more from a mill spell than from either of these cards hitting and just milling a few cards. And the thing that we steal could help us accumulate more momentum than a random 2-1 or a random 3-3 that forces our hand to change all the time. So yeah, I'm cutting those. And in their place, I think Cut Your Losses and Psychic Corrosion might do more work for us. I do want to honor that this is a horror tribal deck, so I'm not trying to say ditch the horrors and just play mill. That's not what's happening. I just think that the math works out a lot better with these cards. Both of these spells have a lot to do with the deck strategy. All we have to do is be careful about the way that effects like these might place a little more pressure onto our commander, since his payoff becomes a greater focus when we're running a lot more mill cards. But that's a storm I think we're prepared to weather. Oh, and before I forget, did anyone else notice that random crypt expires in the list? This is hilarious to me. My first instinct was to yank this out and replace it with like an Ash Barrens because some random tapped land doesn't need to be here, but you know what? I'm actually going to end up keeping this one. I think we can be clever with it. Sometimes the creature that we might steal with Nagathrod might have an off-color activated ability that our mana can't always produce. That's why a card like Exotic Orchard is always key in this deck, for instance. So I think we could actually slot this in as like a white-green land or a green-red land, and that might be kind of funny. Don't metagame unfairly, obviously. I think it would be kind of scummy to wait to see what your opponents are playing before you decide what colors this thing will make, but just in general, a random off-color land might occasionally do some surprise work by helping to activate a Stolen Zakama, or a Brutal Horde Chief, or any other off-color activation from anything we happen to steal. And yes, according to the rules, any commander deck can contain a Cryptic Spires. I know, it's a little strange. But yeah, if you're in the mood for a little risk, this is a weird choice, but I like weird. Alright, that was a bit of a detour, but you know what? On the subject of mana, I think we might need to go to our enchantment section and talk about Black Market next. I like Black Market. I like that it got reprinted in this precon, and I like that its price has been kept in check, but I don't like it in this list. 5 mana's a lot for a mana source in a deck that doesn't care about sacrificing a bunch of stuff or causing a lot of death to happen at all. This card just doesn't do it for me. It's a lot to invest, and I'm not sure that the payoff is always there in ways that it would be for other decks. I like this card elsewhere, but here we'll make this card walk the plank for now. And now, okay, this one will be harder, but honestly, I also want to cut Altar of the Brood here too. I won't lie, this is partially motivated by its price tag. $12 for this effect is a tough pill to swallow. Some turns it will mill 4 or 5 cards, but some turns it might only mill 1 card. I don't dislike this card, and Lord knows that if you're doing any combo stuff, then this is a big finisher for those purposes. But only about a third of Nagathrod decks use this card. Even amongst the top tier, most lavishly upgraded expensive Nagathrod decks, they also still only use this card about a third of the time too. There are arguments for this card and arguments against it. And personally, there's just another card that I would rather have in this deck that I think we'll be better off spending our money on. So that is my motivation here, and I think that we will live without the altar. Specifically, this is a tribal deck, and Kindred Discovery is like $5 or $6 right now, and this deck really wants more card draw. Kindred Discovery is epic and awesome and wonderful and really dang good. Absolutely play this one. If cutting one other card means that we can play a draw engine this powerful, I am all in on that. After that, I'll round things out with 2 more tricky additions. Expel from Erazka is the first. It doesn't look like much, but this removal spell is actually really amazing for this commander. Like, first of all, bouncing to the top of the library, if we have the City's Blessing, is already really annoying. That could really scupper someone's draw step, you know? But second of all, we could also bounce an amazing creature, then mill that creature into the yard right from the top of the library, and then our commander could steal that creature. This is absolutely wicked. What a cool removal spell that might help enable our thievery. I'm enamored by it. We've got to play this one. And finally, this deck absolutely wants the card Irenicus's Vile Duplication. Holy crap, this deck loves duplicates of its commander. It gets wild. Double the mill every time we hit someone, double the stealing effects at end of turn. 2 Nagathrons is so exciting to have in play. It's hard to describe how brutal it gets until you've seen it in person, but this deck thrives off of momentum, and this card will kick us right into overdrive. It's just an uncommon and super cheap to get, and when we play it, our commander will definitely enjoy having a first and second mate. Those are all the swaps. Like I said, only a few to make. Before we go though, I want to give room to a few honorable mentions, namely the expensive ones for players who wish to upgrade the deck even further with a wider budget. There are a lot of directions to go, and the biggest decision will be how many horrors you wish to play. Do you want to stay horror tribal, or will the mill and stealing effects take more and more of your interest with the commander's ability? That is the primary question to ask yourself as you're doing upgrades. Regardless of which you pick though, I must again reiterate the importance of commander doublers here. Spark doubles and Sakashimas will supercharge the commander in hysterical ways, so strongly consider those for your upgrades. I'll also shout out the card Scheming Symmetry, which Nagathrod can turn into a one-sided tutor, since he would mill the other player's card right away. And finally, Rise of the Dark Realms is a fantastic cap to this deck. Milling is fun and all, but this deck likes payoffs for all that milling, and this card is the ultimate payoff in that regard. Oh, and real quick, I also usually highlight budget honorable mentions too, but in this case, the budget consideration is kind of already done for me. The original precon is super solid and will be the cheapest way to acquire the deck. You don't need to get all of those expensive Toxrills or anything like that. Nagathrod's precon is super fun right out of the box. It's really been a joy to see the ways that precons have evolved over time to be able to hold their own right from the off, and that they don't need tons of upgrades to be powerful. Just like in this video, a small handful of swaps sets you well on your way. It's all about which course you want to travel down when you set sail. That will do it from me. Here we have our final Captain Nagathrod list. You can find a link to this deck list down in the description box below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you had a great voyage with Captain Nagathrod, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow sailors, make sure you leave those horrifying suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.